How many people did we lose in 9/11? A little bit less than 3,000. Yeah, it was a little under 3,000, but we can say a round number of 3,000. How did we react to 9/11? Were we upset? We went to war, went arguably 2 wars. We were upset. I had just taken my job here. I'd had the job for, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks, whatever. I'd just taken the job here. And my students met me at the door the morning of, and we came into this room. I didn't have class for a couple of hours, but I held class in here for several hours with students who would randomly come in because they just wanted to understand what had just happened. They were scared. They didn't understand it. They wanted to understand it, but they were scared. So I held class in here pretty much on and off all day around my other classes to try to explain to people why what was happening was happening. I ended up giving public addresses to the community because people were scared. I saw professors, educated people in the hallways right over here make comments like, we're going to make a glass parking lot out of Afghanistan. This was not some bubba in a bar who was drunk saying this. This is 8 o'clock in the morning, stone cold sober, educated man sitting over here. A guy I like, by the way. This is not a bad person. A guy I like right over there in that hallway who said, we're going to make a glass parking lot out of Afghanistan. In other words, we're going to bomb it so heavily that the sand will turn to glass. That's genocide. We're talking about wiping out an entire nation. That was our reaction to 9/11. By the way, how many Afghanis were on that plane? None. 0. But at the time, it didn't matter. We were upset. We were scared. It's a normal human reaction. It ain't right, but it is normal. That's with one 9/11. I did some numbers, like I said, a couple years back, and the numbers are much higher today. But just during the second Intifada, in about a 6 to 7 year period, I can't remember exactly how many years, and the Israelis proportionally, if you take their proportion of their population and do the math to ours, the Israelis had gone through roughly 10 9/11s in about 6 years. You hear people say the Israelis do horrible things to the Palestinians, they occupy their land, they bomb their villages, they do all this other kind of stuff, right? It's true. But here's my question. Before we judge, what would we do if we had 10 9/11s inside of 6 years? We went to war twice over one 9/11. What would we do with 10 of them in 6 years? I think given our military capacity as one of the leading militaries on the planet, there'd be some places that would be flattened rather indiscriminately and horribly. So what I'm saying here is just be careful about judging. Now let's flip that on the other side. The Palestinians during that same time period, that 6-7 year time period I was talking about, had a much higher death toll than the Israelis, much higher. We hear things that people say the Palestinians commit terrorism. They kill civilians. They blow themselves up with suicide bombers in malls. They do horrible things to the Israelis. It's true, they do. Did the math there, and they had roughly 90 9/11s in 6 to 7 years. 91 9/11s. Think about that for a second. 91 of them in 6 to 7 years. You're having them, every other month at that rate or whatever. How would we react in that situation? I can't imagine. I don't like to imagine what we would do. It's a pretty horrific thought. My point is not to justify anything that the Israelis or the Palestinians do to each other. I think it's horrible what happens over there. My point is to step inside their shoes for a moment before you judge. That's all I'm saying. That being said, now, imagine yourself living in that kind of environment with that kind of fear, that kind of hatred, that kind of loss. And let's just put it on a more normal, everyday kind of level. Let's stay away from the really dramatic stuff with the bombs and everything else. My first trip over there was in 1993. Right at the end of the first Intifada. I was roughly your age, never been out of the country before in my life, And I decided to go in the middle of a revolution for my first trip. Most people go to Cancun. I decided to go to Revolution. Probably not the smartest decision I ever made. But I went. Rough trip getting over there, get over there, and you see things on a daily basis that are real hard to let go of. But you start kind of getting used to it at a certain point, and you try to kind of cope. And let me give you an example of something. Just a very normal, everyday example. I was in a cafe one day with a friend of mine. His name was Peter. He's a Scotsman. He was a Quaker. Fascinating little guy. I swear to God, about that tall and about that wide. He's this tiny little guy. You kind of put him in your pocket. He was a little Smurf-like looking guy. But he was great. He's bright, worked with kids over there in the town of Ramallah, and put his life on the line for people. He was a truly heroic figure, one of the first true heroes I'd ever met in my life. We were walking out of a cafe, and as we walked out of the cafe, we're having a conversation, we're laughing and joking and stuff like that. And it's one of those situations where you're walking and talking with somebody and then you realize you're talking to yourself. You ever done that? Where the person's just gone and you start thinking, what the hell happened? And you start looking around. Well, I looked around and I turned around and he was on the floor bleeding. Nothing dramatic, he hadn't been shot, blown up, nothing like that. Seen all that stuff, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a normal, everyday kind of event. He fainted, okay? Well, in this neighborhood, everything's made out of stone or cement, so when you faint, you're not hitting carpeting, you're not hitting a couch, you're hitting stone. Well, he hit stone with his head and busted the back of his skull open. And if you've ever seen a traumatic head injury bleed, you know what I'm talking about. It's like a faucet, it just rolls, okay? So I got on the ground, started wrapping my shirt around his head to try to stop the blood, started kind of elevating his feet, doing the things you normally do in a trauma situation. And then I started looking around me because, of course, a group of people start to form when something like this happens, no matter where you are. And I started yelling, "Get me an ambulance." And I was yelling it in Arabic so they could understand me. And it didn't appear to me that anybody was moving, at least not moving fast enough for me. Now, I'm on the ground because I'm kind of cradling him on the ground and trying to stop the blood, right? So I'm on the ground and you got a bunch of people standing around you, and I'm yelling for an ambulance and nobody's moving. I don't have a lot of a temper, but in a situation like this, it does tend to flare a little bit. And so I grabbed the guy who was nearest me, who wasn't moving fast enough in my opinion, and I grabbed his shirt and I pulled him down to my face level, which took a little bit. And I said, "Why is no one moving? This man could die here. He could bleed to death real quickly with a head wound like this. Why is no one moving? Get me an ambulance." And I'll never forget the expression on his face, because as I looked at his face, he had this certain kind of facial expression. And as I looked up to the crowd, everyone had roughly that facial expression. And the expression is kind of like the expression that you have as an adult when you're trying to explain something to a child that you know they're not going to get. You wish you could explain it to them, but you know you really can't. It's too complicated for them. It's too far out of their reach. And he looked at me and he said, we don't have any ambulances here. And I said, "Fine, then get a freaking taxi. We'll take him to a hospital." He said, "There's no hospitals in this village." I said, "Fine, then we'll go to Ramallah. I've seen hospitals in Ramallah. Just get me a stinking car and we'll go." He said, "We can't go there without permission." I said, "Okay, let me get this straight. I've been living here for a while now, probably about 2 months at that point in time, 6 weeks, something like that." I said, "I've seen a lot of people injured. And you can't go to the hospital without permission?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "How long does it take to get permission?" He said, 6 to 9 months. I said, "So you have to plan your accident 6 to 9 months in advance is what you're telling me?" And he kind of looked at me and, half-heartedly grinned and said, "Yeah, something like that." And I said, "Look, people have been hurt around here a lot of times. You guys got ways of dealing with it. Help my friend." And he said, "I already got a guy with a car coming. There's a woman in the village who can sew him up tonight and at least get him through the night." I said, "Okay." And we did that, and it was a rough night. Things went on. I tell you this story Not one of the dramatic ones with gunfire and bombs and all the other stuff. Just a normal, everyday kind of incident. Think about this. This could have happened to any one of you. Why did he fall? I don't know. My guess is low blood sugar, something like that. But I've seen people here in the United States faint before. I've seen people go into seizures before. I've seen a lot of things happen that once you take them to the hospital, turns out to be no big deal because we have hospitals around to handle this. It would have been a huge deal if you didn't have one, but we do, so it's no big deal. So do they. But here's the deal. When you live under military occupation, I'm going to take the West Bank and blow it up over here. Well, I don't have it over here, do I? Okay. This is now the West Bank. There you go. We were up here in the West Bank. Ramallah, the city just north of Jerusalem, is right here. To go from here to here was a matter of a few miles. Not a big deal. Could have got him there in a car easily. But when you live under military occupation, militaries usually divide lands they control up into zones of control. And those zones are enforced. So if you live here, that means you have an ID card that says, number one, you're Palestinian. Number two, you're a West Bank Palestinian. Number three, you're a West Bank Palestinian from zone 3 or whatever. To be a West Bank Palestinian from zone 3 to go to zone 4 needs permission. If you go without permission, you can and will be shot. If there's no hospital in your zone, that's a problem. This happens a lot. A study I saw that came out in, I think it was 2007, and it channeled how many women had given birth at checkpoints from about roughly 2001 to about 2007, so we're talking roughly 6 years. How many women were in the situation my friend Peter was in, except in this case, it's childbirth. Once again, a normal thing. It's how all of you guys got here. You know, it's a very normal human thing. They go into labor. They want to go to the hospital. They get in a car or an ambulance, go this way. They have to stop at the military checkpoint. That study showed 70 women in the last 6 years had been forced to stop at the checkpoint, not allowed through, and as a result had to give birth at a military checkpoint with a bunch of guys standing there with guns over you. How many of those babies you suppose survived? If I remember correctly in the study, I think 35 of the 70 died. A lot of the women died. It's a pretty horrific situation. Military occupation takes normal life and ramps it up in a direction that's hardly imaginable for most of us. Now that's bad enough if you're occupied for a year or two. If it's 43 years, it's a whole different animal. Now, given that situation, you would expect both sides to hate each other's guts. And it's easy to find people on both sides who do. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty. But here's the astonishing thing, and this is what I wrote my book all about. You find people on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, who not only refuse to hate each other, not only refuse to lash out in violence against one another, but will actually walk across the battle lines, join hands, and fight for peace. They'll put their lives literally on the line to stand up for peace. That's pretty amazing. That defies all those stereotypes where we sit there and go, those people over there are just violent. The folks that I know over there, who are in the peace movement over there, and there's a lot of different varieties of this, are just amazing. They're not just violent. They're heroic. They're doing the same kinds of things that Martin Luther King and Gandhi and many other peace activists through the years have done. But we tend to look at that stuff and we see it in the history and we say, well, Martin Luther King was really cool, Gandhi was really cool, that's great stuff. We read about that in history, but that stuff doesn't happen today. It's happening right now, folks. As we speak, people are doing this stuff. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I'll show you some photographs from some of these movements that I'm talking about.